Okay, good evening, everyone. I'll get our webinar started for tonight. I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to participate in this evening's webinar. My name is Kathy Sisak, and I'm a clinical manager with Disability Prevention Services. Part of what I do with Homewood Health is oversee our national trauma care and depression care programs, and I oversee our treatment programs as well. So tonight's webinar session will be recorded, and so after tonight you'll be able to access a link where you can view the webinar again. If you have any questions as we're going through, just feel free to put your questions into the Q&A chat, and I will stop every so often and answer any questions that come up and make sure we've got some time for questions at the end as well. And all you'll need to participate in tonight's webinar is I'd invite you, if you have a piece of paper and a pencil or a pen or something like that, I will invite you to participate in some just self-reflection questions as we go along, so you can jot down some of your thoughts and responses as we're going through those questions. So welcome to the webinar. Tonight we're going to be talking about transition and change, and particularly as it applies to the pandemic and all the transitions and changes that we've been all going through collectively for the last 18 months or so. So in terms of what we will be doing tonight, we'll be looking at the concept of change management, which often when we think about the concept of change management, it's as it applies to organizational change. And so really excited this evening to talk about change management and how it applies to our own lives as individuals, as family members, as employees, and all the different roles that we have, and how change management can be applied to that, how it can be helpful to us. I'll briefly review some of the main change management models. Some of you may be familiar with some of them or all of them already. And then looking at what are some solution-focused strategies and thinking styles. So considering what are some changes that you're coping with in your own life, could be in your personal life, could be in your role at work, in relationships and so forth, and what are some strategies that you'll be able to use as you're navigating some of those changes. And then also the process of action planning. So how can you actually make a plan around some of those changes that you're making, some steps that you want to put into place with respect to those changes. And so, I mean, I think we all know that change is something that's constant in all of our lives. And we've always known that change is constant and that this is something that's true. But certainly with the pandemic and over the last year and a half, this has really been proven beyond a doubt. We've lived through a pandemic. We're continuing to live through a pandemic. And so in doing so, we've all been coping with numerous changes, as I mentioned, personally, socially, professionally. And so tonight's session really takes a very practical, applied, solution-focused lens. And so the goal is that it will support you to find ways to navigate change. And all of us cope with change in unique and individual ways. So, you know, I'd invite you to think about all of the different strategies that will be presented as a bit of a menu of sorts, and to consider which of these strategies might be most meaningful, most useful, most interesting for you to try as you're navigating some of the changes in your own life. So our goal tonight is to really increase understanding of the practice of change management and what it entails, to gain knowledge about a variety of change management models, to also increase awareness of solution-focused strategies and thinking styles that support change management and navigation, and then finally to develop your action planning skills to assist with tackling change. And so I would just invite you to take a moment to consider what changes you are personally coping with. And this is something that you can just think about for yourself for a moment. You can jot some notes down for yourself as you think about everything that has gone on in the last 18 months with the pandemic, and to try to identify for yourself what changes you might be coping with. It might be in your personal life, could be with relationships, managing health concerns, your own health of family members, aging parents, changes in terms of your social life, your work life. So just invite you to take a few minutes, and we're a minute or so, but just to identify for yourself what might be some of the changes that you're coping with. And also to just consider what challenges or struggles you have with the ongoing change and the transition of our new reality. So there's just been a few questions. People are confirming that you're automatically muted. So just to confirm, everyone is muted, not to worry. Okay. And so when we think about what actually is change, right? And so as we discussed, change is inevitable, it's constant. It can be, negative changes, losses, maybe changes of things that we don't necessarily have control over, changes that we didn't choose for ourselves. Change can also be really positive, on a new job, a new home, moving, if that's a positive change, adding a new family member, adding a new pet, all those kinds of things. And even that can be stressful, as we all know, positive change. And change can be expected, something that we have anticipated that, we expect is going to be happening, or it can be something that really we're blindsided with. Thinking back to the pandemic, when it first happened, and I think, a lot of people thought, okay, this is going to impact us for a few weeks or a few months and things will go back to normal. And so change can be also really lasting, and can really take us by surprise as well. And certainly big changes in our life, small changes, changes can be very stressful, but also at the same time give us hope, can be exciting, new beginnings, can be liberating sometimes change. And then as well, changes can be really smooth, or they can be difficult, or a combination of the two. And so with the pandemic, having so many areas in our life that are affected at the same time by sudden and unexpected change. And so that can be things like our normal routines, our relationships with others, our home, work, and our recreational environments. So all the things that you do as hobbies, any communities or groups that you belong to. When all of that changes all at once, it seems, this can really create a lot of confusion, worry, and stress. And so it's just something to consider how you may have been impacted in some of those areas as well. These changes as well can also feel like a sense of loss or a sense of grief. And so just to also take some time to consider the changes that you've experienced, any loss or grief that comes along with that as well. And so since change is something that we all do need to live with for the rest of our lives, it is really worthwhile to consider and to reflect on how we cope with change, what's our unique and individual way of coping with change, and to consider some other ideas as well that we can use to support us as we cope with changes. And so in terms of change management and what it is, as I mentioned, change management usually is used when we think about big organizations bringing about changes in terms of programs or systems or softwares or anything like that. And so really today we're exploring change management as it applies to each of us on an individual level. And so the change management models that I'll be presenting can really be applied in a personal capacity to help us navigate changes on an individual scale. So these are things that are structured plans and processes that can really be tailored or customized to yourself as an individual in terms of what's interesting and meaningful and helpful to you. And so just I would invite you to consider for yourself is to ask yourself, You know, how do you react to change? What's your typical reaction to change? What do you notice happens inside your body physically when there's a change? What do you notice happens to your behaviors and what you do, how social you are, perhaps how withdrawn you become, your energy levels, just reflecting on how change really impacts you. And also reflecting on how long it takes you to adjust to change. Typically, what does that process look like for you? And how do other people fit into you coping with change? Do you tend to reach out for support from others when you're going through a change? What type of support is helpful to you? Is practical support helpful to you? Is emotional support helpful to you? Spiritual support helpful to you? So just thinking about how you typically react to change and what support you might need from others as well. And so in terms of applying change management and some of the models that we'll go over together tonight, this evening, it really is an individual and unique process. And so it's about getting to know what's helpful for you to manage change. So for example, some people might find change very, very overwhelming, and they may need to reduce activities or hobbies or commitments that they're doing. And others actually might find that keeping up with their activities, their hobbies, their routine will be relaxing for them and containing, and almost in a way provides that kind of security that things are carrying on and will help them to cope with change. So, you know, thinking about what are some past changes that you've coped with, what are things that you've done that's been really helpful to you, what have been the things that you've put into place that have been supportive as you've had to cope with changes, is one of the best ways that we can really plan and put things into place for the changes that we can expect will continue coming. And so in terms of applying change management, one of the steps of that is really applying a structured plan or a process, as well as a set of tools. And so I'll be talking about some thinking tools that you can use as part of that change management plan for yourself. And so as we discussed, individual change management also requires that you understand how you experience change and what you need in order to change successfully. And so if you are a leader in the workplace, or if you're a leader in your family, a parent or what have you, this can be kind of interesting to consider too, is whoever it is that you're leading, you know, everyone is going to deal with change differently. And so what are your needs and what are all the different needs of the family members or your team, and looking at that as well. And I think having self-compassion, we know that change is hard. The application of change management strategies can help to decrease some of the negative consequences that we all experience with change. And so some of the negative consequences with change are things like stress and worry, anxiety, sleep difficulties, all those different things that can pop up when we're trying to cope with change. And so if we can use some of these strategies, have a plan, and have some of these tools that we can use, it can help to buffer some of those negative consequences. And so I'm going to be presenting these 5 steps. So assessing, designing, implementing, managing, and evaluating. So this is kind of big picture before we get into some of these change management models. And so the details and what these 5 steps that we're all invited to try out, what that's going to look like and how we put that into practice in our individual life is really going to look different from person to person. It's going to look different depending on your unique lived experience, on other stressors that you may be coping with, on your own situation, your own context. And so it's just important to recognize, both for yourself and also, as I mentioned, if you're a leader, thinking about your families, whatever context for change management, is that everyone is going to have unique and different needs in terms of change management. What will be helpful to one won't be helpful to the other. Similar to my example there, where, you know, for one person, keeping busy, keeping up with their routine and their activities, that's going to help them with change management or with dealing with change. And for others, kind of reducing activities and kind of simplifying until they've adjusted as change will be helpful. So just really taking that lens and approach of, I think, curiosity about what do I need to get through change, and also what do those around me need to get through change. There really is no one right way or best way to navigate change. And so this is really the beauty of change management. It's something that's dynamic, it's unique, and you can really adjust it depending on people's individual needs. And so these 5 steps are, and you can think about this for some of the changes that you identified for yourself that you're coping with. Whether it's a change in relationship, in routine, in health, family obligations. You can start by sort of reflecting on assessing, so why is this change happening, right? So defining, okay, what's the context? What are all the factors that contributed to this change from coming about? And then designing, so what are the particulars of the change? What exactly has changed, right? And I like to think of this sometimes as kind of the who, what, where, when, how, why, right? So what are all those aspects, and really kind of defining and teasing it out. And then implementing, so what's the action for change? So say, for example, you know, there's a change in family routine because all the kids are home and activities aren't happening and somebody's working from home. What are some of the actions that as a family you might want to put into place in terms of managing this change as best as you can? And then managing, right? So looking kind of short-term navigation, looking at, okay, is it working? How can we improve? Checking in on the plan that you've put into place. And this is where you're going to be kind of adjusting. Here's what's going well, here's what's not going well, and here are some other things that we want to try. So almost thinking about it as an experiment in a way, trying certain things and allowing yourself to adjust. And then evaluating the long-term success. So, you know, is it working? Are there things that we can improve? And so the 4 change management models that I'll present this evening are the ADKAR model, the Lewin's change management model, the Kubler-Ross change curve, and then the Bridges transition model. And so each one of these is going to address and incorporate those 5 phases that I had on the previous slide. So assess, design, implement, manage, and evaluate in their own unique ways. And so I would just invite you to you know, consider the models and consider which model is most interesting to you, or which aspects of the different models you think might be useful for your own situation. And so the ADKAR model is a really well-known model. It's something that Homewood Health has adopted on an organizational level. So it's very well maybe something that you are also really familiar with. And so one of the interesting things is to consider how this ADKAR model actually applies to our own lives beyond organizational change. And so the idea is that in order to have change that can occur, or for change to be implemented well and successfully, these elements need to be present in each individual. And so the elements in the ADKAR model are awareness, right? When we're talking about awareness, it's, is there an understanding that change needs to occur, right? So do we as individuals, or do we, for the people that we're leading, understand that change needs to occur? Also that change is a process, and that not everyone is going to change at the same pace. Not everyone is going to react to change in the same way. And so holding space for that and expecting that range of reactions. One of the things that this model really highlights is that the reasons for change really need to be examined and understood. So really taking the time to drill down to, why is this change happening? What is the change that's happening? Why should it happen? What is the risk of not changing? And so if we think of our individual lives, right now, each and every person is going through such a massive amount of change in various areas of their life. And so applying ADKAR, and each element of ADKAR is really going to look different for every single person. Okay. One of the things as well that I really appreciate about this awareness piece is that we are not to underestimate the power of comfort with how things are today. And so for all of us, because change, it's an opportunity, but it can also feel scary. It can feel, like a risk. It can feel threatening. For most of us, our natural inclination to change is some form of resistance, no matter how small. And so just to be aware of that resistance, that you might feel that it's typical, it's expected. And one of the things that can really be helpful with that, again, is sort of taking the time for discovering, okay, what's the reason for the need for the change? And then desire. So for yourself, really taking the time to reflect on, is there a desire? Is there a motivation? Do you want to support and participate in the change that's required? So again, thinking about your personal change situations, relationships, work, finances, health, whatever it might be, do you feel motivated to take steps to assist or to help that change process along? Moving on to knowledge. So knowledge really is about how do I make the change? So for example, if it's change that's needed because of some kind of a health diagnosis, blood pressure or cholesterol or heart disease or something like that, do you have the information that you need to be able to make the lifestyle changes that your doctor is recommending to you? Do you know how to go about it from a really applied sense? Okay. Ability. So are you able to complete or accomplish the tasks to have the change happen? And so really this is about ability to implement the required skills and the behaviors, as well as the capability to implement the change. And so if ability is identified as missing, then several steps are required to move forward. You may need time to develop new skills and behaviors. So for example, with lifestyle change, if your doctor's suggesting to you, for example, to really change in terms of how you're eating, the types of food you're eating, how you're preparing foods, do you know how to do that? Or do you actually need time to be able to acknowledge perhaps the loss of having to do things differently, and then have some information, some coaching, some learning to be able to have the ability to make that change? And then finally, reinforcement, right? And so reinforcement is really about what other resources are available to support the change on an ongoing basis. And also to prepare for setbacks, right? So typically, if we try and make a change, it's not going to take 1 or 2 or 3 times. It's multiple efforts of being able to make and sustain a change. And so to prepare for any setbacks and how we might deal with them. So looking now at Lewin's change management model. And so this model involves 3 phases, and it sort of mimics that process of melting and reshaping as happens with ice. Can also be thought of as diagnosing, planning, and implementing, and then of course always evaluating to continue making changes as necessary in your life. And so that first model about unfreezing, this is when you're kind of really taking a look at what's going on, what's your situation. It involves increasing motivators or forces for change, and then also decreasing barriers or resistance to change. So this might also be problem solving, troubleshooting, all those things that are like, I can change, but, so looking at all those types of things to be able to troubleshoot and figure out how you can kind of get yourself unfrozen, unstuck, to be able to get moving and get making the change. So that second step of moving, this is where you're kind of taking action. You're implementing changes, and the change is actually happening. In this stage, there may be some trial and error and some kind of experimenting, trying some things out, adjusting to some of the things you've put into place. And this is a really important phase to have some social support as well. So thinking about who can support you at this point. And then finally, refreezing. So this is about, making change permanent in a way, or planning to how you can maintain the changes that you've made and to really establish that new way of living. Okay. This change model by Lewin, it's pretty simple and basic, but it's preferred by many because it really works to uncover old patterns. It looks at our overlooked problems, the blind spots that we all have when it comes to change, and also that simplicity to find new ways of being or living is quite appealing to some. So moving us on now to the Kubler-Ross change curve. And so this strategy borrows from the 5 stages of grief. So this is really a largely applicable strategy for people given the past year and a half. And in particular, all of the losses that we're all grieving, all of the collective losses that we've experienced related to the pandemic. And as well, the certain senses of loss as the world reopens and then shuts down a little bit and then reopens, so that kind of back and forth and managing that difficult dynamic. And, thinking about the losses that you've personally experienced, the loss of the way that it once was, if things have reopened in your workplace, perhaps the loss of working from home for some and returning back on site may also be a loss. And so these stages of, moving from shock to denial, frustration, depression, experimenting, decision and action, acceptance and integration, it's just a reminder that this isn't something that's linear, sequential. We're complex beings, and so we can really flow back and forth in these stages. It's not a set in stone kind of flow. It's going to look different for each of us. And so when we think about the shock part of the change is really that event or decision requiring change. That could be the surprise of occurrence or the surprise of hardship in the midst of change. And the denial part is really about not believing the change, not believing the decision requiring change has occurred or what it is. Frustration with the change and its results consequence. It could be anger, could be sadness as well. Depression, really related to feeling low morale, feeling a decrease in optimism, a decrease in hope. And then with experimenting, starting to test out and engage with the change, right? So, I think about that experimenting part as almost entering a point of surrender or acceptance about what's the impact of the change and then trying to work with it in a sense. With decision and action, trying to adapt to the change, learning how to work with it, and then starting to experience some sense of hope, some sense of optimism. And then finally, acceptance or integration, the change is achieved and being maintained. So the Bridges transition model, this is really a people-centered model. And this is focused on supporting to manage people's experience of transitioning to change. And so this model is similar to the Kubler-Ross model, but it doesn't focus as much on the actual change, but it's really about the transition to change and how people experience this transition. And so just being aware of your own experience of some of these and holding space for yourself, allowing yourself to feel some of these things, with starting with endings, loss, and letting go. So just acknowledging and feeling the feelings that come with an ending is a crucial step. So the sadness, the grief, the frustration that you might feel. The neutral area, so that's the learning process to adjust and adapt to change. And so this really is about having a lot of communication to avoid or resolve confusion, any issues that come up, frustration that comes up. And then finally, new beginnings. So that's about acceptance of the change, renewed hopefulness and optimism, perhaps even some celebration. And this stage also focuses on experiencing emotions, so holding space for how your emotions have evolved and where your emotions are now. Okay, So I'll just invite you again to self-reflect, and if you feel comfortable, you can certainly share your answers to the 2 questions in the chat box, and I can take some time to read out people's responses. So just considering if any of these change management models resonate with you in terms of how you've navigated change in the past, and then also how you would like to approach change as we move into the next phase of our new reality. So I'll just encourage you to take a minute to think about that. If anybody wants to share their reflections, you're more than welcome to do so, and I can read them out to the group as well. Okay. So now that we've gone through some of the change management, okay, I've got some comments here coming through. So comment coming through that change, to accept that change is inevitable and not to fight it. Absolutely. Yeah, that idea of acceptance, of surrendering. And, you know, sometimes we have difficulty to accept the change itself because it may not be something that we've chosen for ourselves. It's not a choice we made. And then in that case, it might be easier to start with not necessarily accepting the change, but accepting the impact that the change is having on our lives from a practical sense, from an emotional sense. Absolutely. Okay. A comment about the ADKAR model seems to fit my style. I certainly try to work through the issue, apply, access if it works, and reapply for sure. So that reworking, reevaluating. Okay. And then a couple questions coming in about the models, whether there's a model, in my opinion, that interacts better with mental health problems, and whether the Bridges model is more compatible or a better starting point for someone with anxiety. Okay. Okay, so that was kind of a multi-part question there. Yeah, I think that's such a great question. I think in terms of which model is going to be the best fit, it really comes down to which model sits the best with you. So because change is so unique, I think for some individuals, they're going to look at a model that is more simple and maybe has, you know, 3 steps, and that will appeal to them. For other people, they prefer something that's a bit more structured, that has more of the phases like the Kubler-Ross, and that will appeal to them more. So I think that's kind of part of the process, is looking at, based on what my needs are, what do I find more helpful? Is it kind of having these broader sort of steps that are more flexible, that are more open? Do I prefer something that's a bit more prescribed, a bit more contained, a bit more categories? That would be sort of my feedback for that. Okay. Another question coming in, great question. Suggestions for dealing with uncertainty using the change management models. All seem to rely in early steps on fully understanding the change, and this is difficult with respect to the pandemic. Oh, I couldn't agree more. What a great comment. So much uncertainty, so many unknowns, and so much back and forth. And so I think your point is such an important one, and I thank you for bringing it up. I think what I would sort of propose with that is, in terms of fully understanding the change, how do you fully understand the change if there's so much uncertainty? And what I would say to that is, at least fully understanding, or understanding as much as possible, what's the impact on the change for you, right? And so thinking about the pandemic and the impact that it's had on all of our lives and all of the uncertainty, we might not know exactly what the restrictions are going to be like, when things are going to open, when things are going to close, what that's going to mean if you've got aging parents, if you've got kids in school, if you've got teenagers, all those considerations. But looking at the change management models from the perspective of, okay, what is at least the impact of the change on me? For example, having kids at home or needing to make arrangements for parents, for example. And then also using the change management model as best you can in terms of considering, what do I know and then what's uncertain. And with respect to what's uncertain, I think that's when we get into strategies more around acceptance, surrender. What are the strategies that I can put into place to cope with my own anxiety or worry that comes up with uncertainty? Okay, and another participant has added the comment that identifying old toxic patterns is painful, but I have found to be the best starting point for change. It's more comforting to look at our problems as having happened to us and out of our control, rather than resulting at all from our actions and in our power to change. Yeah, great point. So looking, absolutely, I think in terms of learning how we can deal with change and moving forward, looking at how we've coped with change in the past, what are our blind spots, what are our toxic patterns, as this person has pointed out, and looking at what's out of our control, but then also empowering ourselves. What is within my control? What am I able to do to support myself to deal with this change? So looking at some strategies now around healthy thinking leading to change. And so the 3 Ps that are proposed in terms of a reintegration mindset. So this is purpose. So the purpose is really, how can everyone's well-being and contributions be incorporated? What can be achieved by me or by other leaders or teams or team members or family members? And also perspective. How can I or we as a group move boldly into the future? And so this style of integration mindset was put forth by Deloitte in 2020. And the idea was to provide stability in a world that's ever changing, ever evolving, filled with so much uncertainty. And the ultimate aim with thinking, or using this lens of thinking, is really to plan and execute with a focus on the future while learning from the past. So these 3 Ps leave room for recovery, recovery post-pandemic, and provide a firm foundation to foster openness and hopefulness about possibilities moving forward. And so this second solution focused strategy is about also healthy thinking to navigate change. And this strategy is really for all of us who are in the stage of transition. And so it's really about that change is constant, as we've discussed, and our world post-pandemic is one that will be in constant flux. We can see how a growth mindset is helpful during change and transition. And when we talk about a growth mindset, what we're talking about is one that allows people to ride the waves, the ups and the downs during this period. And it's a mindset about having a soft place to land while changes are being implemented and worked toward in order to be more permanent. This allows us to recognize where we're at and allows you to meet yourself there. So wherever you are in terms of coping with these changes, if you're in the early stages of changes or in the middle or somewhere at the end, it's about meeting yourself where you're at. Having compassion for yourself, lowering expectations, and also to be awareness of your ability to leap and to grow and to really transform from the changes that you're coping with. So in the same way that we can see changes as difficult, there's been a lot of losses with the change, also making space to see how some of the changes that we've had to cope with really have been opportunities to do things differently, to innovate, to allow ourselves to take risks, and to find creative solutions to some different dilemmas that have been brought about by the pandemic. And so now looking at changing pandemic realities, again, would invite you to just notice about how you're thinking about things as it pertains to the pandemic, right? And so Brene Brown talks about the stories that we tell ourselves, or sometimes it's described as, the tapes that play in our head. And so as you're thinking about the pandemic and all the changes that you've personally had to cope with and are continuing to cope with, what's kind of that voice inside your head? What's the story you're telling yourself about how are you coping? Do you notice yourself saying things like, things will never improve? My kids will never return to school. We'll never be able to go on vacation. It won't be possible to go back to large gatherings. It won't be possible to go back to our community activities. So just noticing some of those ways of thinking about the pandemic and using some of these strategies to kind of evaluate your thoughts, notice if they're distorted in any way, and to hopefully arrive at more balanced thoughts that will hopefully have you feeling a little bit more hopeful about things. And so asking yourself, what's the evidence for this thought? What's the evidence for the thought that things will never improve? What's the evidence against that thought that things will never improve? What are the chances that that thought will become true? And what's the worst thing if it does become true? Is it reasonable to think? So is there another more balanced way of thinking? So it might be like things are really, really difficult. Things have been really difficult for a long time, but we can expect that things are going to improve with time. And then also just thinking about how is worrying about this helping me, and how else can I redirect my energy? Instead of worrying about it, are there different things I can do for myself in terms of self-care, social support, doing the activities that I enjoy, to be able to soothe myself with the very real worries that you're experiencing related to change. And so now moving on to the process of action planning. So I'd invite you to think about one of the changes that you're currently dealing with in your life, in your personal life, your work life, your relationships, family, your financial health, whatever it might be, your physical health. So just to consider one of those changes that you're making. And we've talked about the change management models. We've talked about some thinking strategies and these solution-based mindsets. And what follows that is really the process of action planning. As we've discussed, change is constant and it's inevitable. And in some people might even say that change is essential so that things don't become stagnant and boring. So now we're going to explore that process of creating an action plan that helps to support with the bumps and lumps and the challenges that come with actually implementing change. As we go through the steps of action planning, just keep in mind the change management model that resonates most with you, seeing how the model and its curve or phases can work in collaboration with action planning. And so these initial steps of doing the groundwork, brainstorming, and choosing and applying the solution to the problem are really similar to the general steps that the change management follows that were discussed earlier of assess, design, implement, manage, and evaluate. I think, going through that process of action planning, giving yourself a lot of flexibility, permission to experiment, to try different things, to start over, to stick with it, right? Sometimes when we put those action plans into place, they're not going to be effective right away. And so kind of sticking with it and getting support as we need. When we start to look at doing that action plan, the first thing is really identifying what needs changing or what is the problem that we're trying to address, right? So really kind of getting really into the nuts and bolts of, okay, what is the problem? What's the change here? And then brainstorming. And so just a reminder, when we're brainstorming, there's no wrong or right option. It's kind of considering all options that there might be in terms of using with this change, looking at all the ways that you can solve, address, navigate, adapt, adjust to, approach the problem, ignore the problem. So you kind of brainstorm all the options. And then some people will talk about looking at what are the pros and cons, what are the possible risks and benefits of all those options, and then choosing and applying the solution to the problem. And that's the change that's going to need to happen. So in terms of creating the action plan, once the solution is chosen, or once you've decided what steps you're going to take, it's really, really effective to create and write your action plan down in detail. And you can do this in 4 steps. And so you can certainly write this on paper and, on a piece of paper. I suggest that people put this into their phones, because you've always got your phone with you, or most of the time, so you've always got it handy with you. And so when you're creating the action plan, this is where you're getting practical. So for example, if you've got your kids, home from school or home from daycare, what have you, you've got your teenagers at home, it's about making a schedule or a plan. Okay, who's responsible for what? What's going to be the routine? What's going to be the plan? What resources need to be purchased to be able to execute that plan? If it's about managing a health issue, right? So it's about what needs to happen in terms of lifestyle, diet, exercise, going to appointments, social supports, etc. So thinking about the first step, it's really about listing the steps of the plan. You're trying to, in a way, write the instructions, or kind of the recipe down for what you're going to do in terms of this change. These are really small and large measurable goals for yourself. So you're thinking kind of short term and long term, and writing out the specifics and the logistics of each step. Okay? Holding yourself accountable by setting time frames. So be reasonable and fair to yourself about how long it's going to take you to do some of these things, but setting some deadlines for yourself. It's also a great way to increase your motivation. It feels good when we set out to do something and we've accomplished it. It kind of allows us to feel motivated and to continue going. You want to identify any obstacles. So what might get in the way of you being able to execute your plan? And so having that in mind is going to help you deal with those obstacles when they come up. So for example, if the change that you're trying to deal with is a new health diagnosis, and planning in advance, okay, what am I going to do on the nights that I'm running out of time to cook meals with what's in line with what's needed for my health? So that might be, okay, well, I need to make sure I've got a couple meals in the freezer that are in line with, what the doctor's suggesting that I'm eating. It might be getting help with meals. It might be simplifying meals, whatever it might be, but kind of having a safety net in place already for yourself. And then step 4, evaluating progress routinely and often, right? So really wanting to evaluate, and making changes as necessary, seeing this as something dynamic that can be improved and built upon. So we really want to be fluid and flexible in that process of action planning and navigating change. As change continues to occur, you will learn to adapt and learn and grow, and really master certain things and certain changes and coping with change. And so in conclusion, we know that change takes planning and work. It really takes learning and adjusting. It requires a lot of stretching. Change can be really, really uncomfortable, of course, and it's hard. The idea is to use what you've learned today to plan for and assist in tackling changes, and also to remind yourself about being kind and compassionate to others, but also to yourself as you navigate change and transition. And as difficult as change is, fortunately, there are these change management models and strategies that we can use that can assist us with that process. We know that active and thorough planning, so identifying what our needs are to manage the change, looking at what are the resources we have to manage change and what are obstacles, really supports success in terms of implementing change and working towards change and moving forward. So I will pause here just to see if there's any questions that come through. There was a question that came up earlier about how do you get from neutral to acceptance, right? How do you get to that? And acceptance is such a hard thing. I think especially if it's accepting something that maybe feels unfair or there's injustice, or it's something that we haven't chosen for ourselves. And so sometimes what can be helpful with acceptance is to do it in small bits and pieces. And so what I mean by that is when you think about the pandemic, for example, and just the innumerable changes that we're all faced with, you know, it's quite daunting and probably unrealistic to think about kind of just accepting everything, going from neutral to acceptance. But thinking about where you're at right now, the changes that you're coping with, and what parts are you able to accept? What parts of how your routine, how your relationships, how your life has been impacted by the pandemic? What parts of that, what aspects can you accept? And focusing on those parts as a beginning point. Okay. So just a reminder in terms of accessing resources. So Homewood Health is proud to be a lead partner in the Wellness Together initiative in partnership with Kids Health Phone and Step Care Solutions. Homewood Health is delivering a full range of free mental health counseling and support to people of all ages across the country. This is something that's funded through Health Canada, and it's available in both English and French as an online portal and website. It can also be accessed at wellnesstogether.ca or by calling 1-866-585-0445. And in terms of contacting Homewood Health, the numbers are there for both English and French online. If you are a customer contact and have any questions or specific needs that you'd like to help addressing, please do reach out to your account representative or team. You are also more than welcome to call our 1-800 number, and we'd be happy to assist you. Okay. So I'll just wait for another moment to see if there's any other questions that come through. Okay, I don't see any other questions coming through. So would just like to take the time to thank each of you for attending tonight's webinar. And just a reminder that the link for the webinar will be made available, so you'll be able to access it after this evening. So thank you again. I'll stay on for a few minutes if any questions pop up, and I wish you all a good evening and stay healthy and well.